Not enough operators to take emergency calls.
CBS 17 started investigating.
It is impacting quality of service. They still have 26 vacancies. Is this acceptable?
It's all based on the call volume.
Bottom line, if you call, have patience and stay on the line.
A COVID-19 outbreak has led to staffing shortages at Durham's 911 call center. It's a story CBS 17 first told you about last month. Now a longtime Durham firefighter is talking only with CBS 17 about what that shortage has meant for response times. Our Amy Cutler taking those concerns to city leaders. She's live in Durham with what both sides have to say. Amy.
Yeah, Angela, city leaders tell me that this is an ongoing issue, one that they are trying to address. And that's why some 911 calls that would go to the Durham call center are going to Raleigh's 911 center. But that's creating problems of its own.
It's concerning to us. It should be concerning to them.
You dial 911 in emergencies when seconds count. But in Durham County, that call could go to Raleigh Center. That's because COVID has led to staffing shortages.
Well, we know it's not seamless.
Jimmy Wright has been a Durham firefighter for 21 years. He's now the president of the Firefighters Association. Over the last month, he tells me he's heard from several members, firefighters responding to wrong addresses or having incomplete information.
Our dispatchers don't have any connection with whoever's calling, which means they can't figure out the address.
Wright showed me emails he sent to city leaders asking that issues be addressed. They responded with information, but not solutions. I took those concerns to Bo Ferguson, the deputy city manager.
We are returning staff on a rolling basis. Some staff have already returned this week.
He acknowledges the staffing issues and tells me firefighters and police are stepping up to help with dispatching calls. He says only 11% of all calls are being answered in Raleigh.
We crunch a lot of numbers to come up with our response time, and I honestly think we should do more research before we agree to any conclusions that response times have changed at all.
But Wright tells me staffing is an ongoing problem and that response times for fire calls keep going up. According to the National Fire Protection Association standards, 90% of calls are supposed to be processed in 64 seconds or less. In Durham, he says, less than 18% of fire calls are handled in that time.
Now, the deputy city manager couldn't tell me how many openings the call center currently has or how many employees are out with COVID. He said that information is just not something that the city gives out. He also couldn't tell me how much longer they would require the help of Raleigh's call center. We're going to stay on top of this for you. For now, we are live in Durham. Amy Cutler, CBS 17 News.
Staffing shortage at Durham's 911 center means some calls are being answered in Raleigh. It's a story we've been investigating for more than a month now. And new tonight, CBS 17's Amy Cutler obtained radio traffic for 2 911 calls that were answered in Raleigh. And Amy, you played those calls for city leaders. What did they have to say?
Well, Maria, city leaders are coming to the defense of the 911 call center here behind us and its director. But the confusion and frustration in the radio traffic from those 2 911 calls is clear.
Did you get apartment number yet? I'm working on it. It came from Raleigh.
The call came in the day after Christmas. Durham first responders dispatched to a person asking for medical help.
We'll circle the complex again and wait until we can hear back.
They're left hoping someone might come out and flag them down.
Tried that caller multiple times and it rings and goes to voicemail.
Then there's a call that came in December 11th.
Do you have a better location for the patient? This call came from Raleigh and they gave us the address of.
Last month, Durham's 911 call center experienced a COVID outbreak, and to help, Raleigh Center started answering some of their calls. That remains the case.
We're walking around the building right now to see if we see anything.
The Durham Firefighters Association and its police association tell me it's a problem that they receive wrong addresses or incomplete information and that it's leading to delays in their response times. I took those concerns to the mayor.
What would your message be to those firefighters and police officers?
I would like to know first the extent of which is happening. I mean, if it's happening a lot, it's a big problem. I haven't heard that.
The city says only 11% of all calls coming into Durham are answered in Raleigh, and they tell me it hasn't impacted response times.
Our 911 service is done very well.
I played one of their calls for City Councilman Mark Anthony Middleton.
It's incredibly impressive to hear professionals so committed to saving lives that even with spotty information, they are banging their heads against the wall figuratively to find out if anyone needs help.
Now, I've reached out to the city and county trying to verify that, in fact, the response times have not changed since Raleigh started taking some of Durham's calls. I haven't heard back. I will keep you posted when I do. Durham, the city, could not tell me tonight how much longer they would require Raleigh's help. Live in Durham, Amy Cutler, CBS 17 News.
All right, Amy.
Over the weekend, no one was in a local 911 center to take emergency calls. Good evening, everyone. I'm Rod Carter.
And I'm Angela Taylor. We've been investigating problems and staffing shortages at the Durham 911 Center for months. Saturday night, with no one in Durham available, all calls had to first go to Raleigh.
Yeah, CBS 17's Amy Cutler has been investigating and looking for answers into this. And Amy, what is Durham saying about all of this?
Well, Rod, Angela, the city is telling me that this is the result of unplanned absences and that they're reviewing the matter. But that answer is not good enough for some people who are telling me this is part of a much larger problem.
Reviewing and investigating.
That's Deputy City Manager Bo Ferguson in a videotape message addressing the staffing shortage at Durham's 911 call center. It meant all 911 calls that came in Saturday night were answered in Raleigh. The information then relayed back to Durham so first responders could be dispatched.
The problem's not being resolved, or they're not hiring, they're not filling those positions.
I first introduced you to Jimmy Wright, the president of the Professional Firefighters of Durham, back in January. Raleigh's 911 call center had been taking some of Durham's calls for about a month. He was concerned it could lead to an increase in response times. Back then, Durham said a COVID outbreak caused the staffing shortage. But now, 5 months later, nothing has changed.
Wake County Communications is going to be taxed, trying to handle Durham's calls and theirs.
I reached out to Raleigh's 911 call center. They tell me they were notified Saturday afternoon Durham would need additional help. The director writing, there is a possibility that there could be delays for those in Wake County. However, I haven't found any at this time. Durham tells me they're supposed to have 60 people who can answer calls. They're down 26 positions. 4 slots will be filled soon.
It is not an approved practice of the city or the 911 leadership to route all incoming 911 calls to the Raleigh Wake Center.
Now, the Raleigh 911 call center tells me they are not being paid for this assistance and that they anticipate it stopping in June. The Durham 911 call center would not put a timeline on it. I also want to mention that we received an email from a concerned 911 call taker in Raleigh tonight saying that this was impacting morale and the work they do. We're going to keep pushing for answers on this one. Live in Durham, Amy Cutler, CBS 17 News.
Yeah, in Wake County, 911 operators in Raleigh helping the city of Durham pick up the slack for months. Now an employee at the Raleigh 911 call center wants you to hear their story.
CBS 17's Amy Cutler has been investigating shortages at the Durham call center since December. Only on CBS 17 tonight, she is live in Raleigh with much more on what that employee had to say. Amy.
Yeah, Rod, that employee is frustrated and concerned. They say they've spoken with coworkers and managers. Nothing has changed. Now, we are not identifying that employee and have altered their voice because they still work at this center.
When you call 911, seconds matter, and that's why the call takers and dispatchers at the Raleigh 911 Center are trained to determine your location in Wake County first. It's so they can get first responders on their way to you. When they answer calls for Durham, the same mapping programs don't work.
Before we start at work, we spend 3 months in a training academy learning everything about Wake County's geography.
Raleigh started helping Durham back in December. City leaders said a COVID outbreak created a staffing shortage, but that assistance continues. Saturday night, Durham had no call takers. All 911 calls went to Raleigh.
We just barely managed to keep up with our own call volume. Adding on to that, the 100+ calls per shift we get from Durham, it's overwhelming, which means that calls are getting missed.
The employee tells me they call people back as quickly as they can. One such incident happened on New Year's Eve.
So as we're going through them, we found one of a person that was having a legitimate medical emergency. whose call was not answered and whose help was delayed.
In response to my questions, the director of Raleigh's 911 center, Dominic Nutter, wrote, "As with any concerns, we have an open door policy and are here to listen to our employees. However, in this particular case, the support was essential." He tells me his center is handling about 9% of Durham's 911 calls. They make up less than 5% of Raleigh's call volume.
That employee tells me that they were given just 1 hour's notice that they would be taking all of Durham's 911 calls Saturday night. That employee is concerned if this continues, people will leave. Live in Raleigh, I should say. Amy Cutler, CBS 17.
All right.
In an emergency, seconds count. And that's why CBS 17 is following up on staffing shortages at the Durham 911 Center. Good evening, I'm Angela Taylor.
And I'm Rod Carter. Glad you could join us tonight. Those staffing issues in Durham have led to Raleigh's center having to answer some of those calls. Tonight, only on CBS 17, we are hearing from an employee at Durham's center.
New at 11, Amy Cutler has been on this story from the beginning. She's live in Durham for us. And Amy, what did this employee have to say?
Angela, Rod, that employee is fed up. They tell me it is impacting morale and the quality of service that they provide. Now, since they still work at the center, we're not identifying them and have altered their voice.
Longer shifts with no breaks, being called in on your days off. That's what a Durham 911 call center employee tells me has become the norm.
The stress levels and lack of time off, lack of time to decompress means more mistakes, more errors. You have to think very critically as a call taker and a dispatcher.
I first started reporting about staffing shortages at the Durham 911 Center back in December, when city leaders confirmed a COVID outbreak meant Raleigh would be taking some of their calls. That help continues. As of last week, Durham was supposed to have 60 employees trained to answer 911 calls. They have 26 vacancies.
What do you think that might mean for residents who are calling 911 in an emergency?
Delayed time in answering the call because there's less people to take the calls, so people are waiting longer.
After calling and emailing the director of the center, Randy Beeman, I stopped by.
Hi, we're with CBS 17. We're just wondering if Randy Beeman is around.
With COVID restrictions still in place, I received an answer through the bell outside.
He is not available today.
Perhaps more concerning, the center is lowering its minimum staffing levels. CBS 17 obtaining internal emails that show they'll require 5 personnel or 4 personnel on shifts. Compare that to an internal email from back in April 2019. It had been 8 employees, and before that, 9 or 10.
2 people are always dispatching and not taking any calls, and so anybody that remains in excess of that would be people answering the 911 calls.
That means they could have just 2 or 3 people to answer calls on a shift. I showed those documents to Councilman Mark Anthony Middleton.
I don't think those numbers should be interpreted that a determination has been made that we don't need the staffing. That's what happens when you have a staffing situation. You have to adjust.
Then there is the issue, of course, of the 911 calls that go to Raleigh. They're supposed to ring here in the Durham Center for 30 seconds before going to the Raleigh Center. Bottom line, if you call 911 here in Durham County, have patience and stay on the line. Live in Durham, Amy Cutler, CBS 17 News.
All right, Amy, thank you. If there's something going...
For the first time in months, Raleigh is no longer handling 911 calls from Durham. Thanks for joining us. I'm Angela Taylor.
And I'm Rod Carter. So glad you're here tonight. Since December, we have been reporting that because of staffing shortages at the Durham 911 call center, thousands of calls every single month were being handled by operators in Raleigh.
CBS 17's Amy Cutler first broke this story. And Amy, after all this time asking questions, the city is finally providing a few answers.
Yeah, they are, Angela and Rod. The city says it has been working on this situation for months now. They've been hiring people, training them. Still tonight, they have more than 24 open positions.
We've been working towards this day for some time now.
What started as a temporary fix, Durham's 911 call center having Raleigh help answer some of its calls, has finally ended 6 months later. Back in December, the center's director told me a COVID outbreak led to the staffing shortage, but it persisted. So what changed today?
3 new people out on the floor, even though that vacancy number hasn't changed in the last few weeks.
Deputy City Manager Bo Ferguson says 3 trainees can now answer calls independently. They've also added some part-time workers. Another 4 employees are in training and should be on the floor within 6 weeks. But Ferguson admits the center still has 26 open positions. They're supposed to have 64 total employees. That means only 60% of their positions are currently filled.
Our vacancy number doesn't reflect our part-time staff. They are in a separate pool.
The center has changed its staffing requirements. CBS 17 obtaining internal emails that show they'll require just 4 or 5 employees on a shift. Compare that to an internal email from back in April 2019. It had been 8, and before that, 9 or 10.
All of our shifts are based on the expected call volume, and if a particular shift has particularly low call volume, that's possible.
The city says 92% of the calls that came in April were answered in 30 seconds or less. If it was longer than that, the calls went to Raleigh where they were answered. The question now becomes what happens to those calls since Raleigh will no longer be answering them. We're going to stay on top of this for you. Live in Durham, Amy Cutler, CBS 17 News.
All right, again, Amy has been on the story for months. She broke this story. She's getting